Thank you, Richard, for your introduction, and also thank you very much to Paul and to the organisers of the conference for inviting me to contribute. As a social scientist, I feel honoured to have been invited to present and to contribute today. Before today, I always describe myself as a social scientist, but I'm fairly unusual in the field of education in that the designs of choice for me are almost exclusively randomised controlled trial designs and quasi-experiments and systematic reviews of randomised controlled trials. And so I'm also looking forward to presenting to an audience where I anticipate there won't be a hostile response when I mention randomised controlled trial and education intervention in the same sentence. But more on the futile paradigm war later. So clearly we understand the association between education and health and education, and that in some cases that this is causal. But in education, unlike in health, we have a dearth of experimental research to investigate questions of effectiveness or efficacy. And so what I want to do today is talk about a history of randomised controlled trials in education. And along the way, I'll talk about the opportunities and challenges and some missed opportunities. And I'll focus on one particular randomised trial that I've undertaken and one particular systematic review. And I'll try to persuade you that experimental research is possible in education, and that the reasons why so little has been done are not to do with the fact that it's not possible or feasible. It's to do more with things like a lack of political will, a lack of funding particularly, and also hostility towards the design from within the research community itself. So I'm going to give a brief history of some of the milestones. I think it's a rich history, I hope it is, but also I'm going to try to persuade you that there is a paucity of trials in this area. And I'm going to start with the first known randomised trial in the modern period in humans, and with thanks to Louise Fortisland and Ian Chalmers for rediscovering this trial in 2007. And I'm just going, it was actually by J.E. Walters at Purdue University in the School of Mechanical Engineering in 1931. And I'm just going to read to you what Walters said about his trial. So he said this: 5 senior students, each of whom had a good scholarship record, a pleasing personality, excellent health, and fine social environment, were chosen to act as personnel counsellors for the members of the freshman class who at the end of the first 8 weeks of school happened to be delinquent in scholarship in the School of Mechanical Engineering in 1929 to 30. And the 220 delinquent freshmen were divided into 2 groups by random sampling. Not a very, by our standards, not a very politically correct description of what he did. And so basically the intervention was counselling by senior students once a week over a term. And at the end, Walters looked at scholastic delinquency as an outcome measure and found that there was a reduction of about 21% in the group where there was the intervention. Like all good scientists, he replicated his study the following year, and this time in a much bigger sample with about 1,000 students, and he introduced a third arm into the trial, which was a select group of faculty members, and looked at whether being counselled by a senior student was more or less effective than being counselled by a faculty member. And then later, in 1940, Lindquist wrote this book called The Statistical Analysis in Educational Research. And in this book, he talks a lot about the natural unit of allocation in education being the class or the school rather than the individual pupil. And actually, he writes as though random allocation is being routinely done in educational research. And I can only conclude from the fact that we can't find any other trials from this period that either they weren't published or, in fact, they may have been published and the process of random allocation hasn't been very well described. I do know of another quasi-experiment that was undertaken in the 1920s in the teaching of spelling, but there's no description of random allocation. I will just mention that both of these pioneers in education research, experimental design, actually predated the two seminal MRC randomized controlled trials. Oh yes, and incidentally, Lindquist also talked about the appropriate analysis using cluster means to adjust for clustering in this book. Okay, so I think what I want to argue is that since the early pioneers, it's almost as though the educational researchers discovered the experimental design and then forgot about it or ignored it. And so in the 1930s to the 2000s, there's a dearth of high-quality RCTs in education research. Of course, you'll have heard of the seminal trials, the Cambridge-Somerville trial in 1935 and the Tennessee class size experiment of 1985. And, of course, the theoretical work from Stanley, Campbell and Cook in this period. But despite those iconic trials and that iconic work in theorizing experimental design and quasi-experimental design, there is actually a lack of trials per se, and also those trials that we can find tend to be of rather weak quality. So, this being the legacy conference for John Snow, I think I need to provide some evidence for the statement that I've just made. So, this is a table of a few systematic reviews, 5 systematic reviews that were undertaken in the first half of the 2000s. And I'm going to talk in a little bit of detail about this one, the phonics instruction, in a minute. But these are all sort of in the area of literacy, which is my substantive area. And you can see that of 48, only 48 RCTs in 5 systematic reviews, that most of these were concentrated in the US, with only a couple in the, 4 in the UK and 1 in Australia. And secondly, I did some methodological work with colleagues in health and health education about the same time, where we used a systematically assembled data set of 86 drug trials, 86 health education or health promotion trials, and 86 trials from education. And just a quick glance at that table, where we looked at 5 items from the consort statement, you can see that education was not doing very well. So, for example, none of the 86 trials justified their sample size, and none of them described concealed randomization. Only 14% described blinded follow-up, and yet this is a profession which is involved in assessment of pupils all the time, and they didn't see the need to blind the outcome assessment. Only one trial, so this has been rounded up, only one trial used confidence intervals, and the authors of that trial wrote to the journal the following volume and apologized for confusing its readership, for introducing confidence intervals. And you can also see that statistical power was low in 85% of the trials. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about one of the systematic reviews that I have undertaken. This systematic review was commissioned by the Department for Education in 2006. At the same time that an expert review, which you probably have heard of, called the Rose Review, was also commissioned by the Department for Education. And I'll just give a little bit of information about each of these reviews so you can think about the potential for bias in the reviews when you come to hear the results. So the Rose Review was commissioned, so Jim Rose was commissioned to do that. The Phonics Review, the systematic review that I undertook with colleagues at York and Sheffield, was by competitive tender, and it was a systematic review, and it was also an update and replication of a previous systematic review, very high profile one that had been undertaken in the US by the National Reading Panel. And we included only randomized trials, but we did look for unpublished trials, which the American systematic review had not done. The evidence for the Rose Review was basically observation of best practice in teaching phonics. I should just say that before these two reviews were commissioned, children in this country were taught to read using the Searchlights model, which is a system of drawing on four methods that we know can help children to learn to read. And following the publication of the two reviews, the government of the time switched overnight to a policy of which, and those of you who have young children will know about this, which was that all children would be taught using synthetic systematic phonics as the first and method of teaching reading. So what did we find in our systematic review? We searched from 1970 to the present time, and we searched for randomized controlled trials. We found only 12 individually randomized controlled trials. All were very small, and only one was from the UK. We did put all these trials together in a meta-analysis. The interventions are very homogeneous. The outcomes are very homogeneous. This is quite unusual in education, but in this one area, we did find a lot of homogeneity. But we only had, well, moderate weight of evidence. Really, I think that's an optimistic statement. But you know, we have our funders to think about and the policymakers, and so we agreed that the weight of evidence was moderate. So this was because there were very few trials, only one done in the UK, and all of the trials that we found were of rather weak quality. They did vary a lot, but there were no large, robust randomized controlled trials. Only 3 of the trials directly compared 2 different methods of teaching phonics. So all of the trials looked at comparing systematic phonics with a different method, which is known as whole language, the whole language approach. But only 3 of them actually compared the 2 different kinds, which are synthetic and analytic. And synthetic phonics is basically where it's sounding out and blending, and analytic phonics is really where the children are shown how to analyse words that have similar phonics at the beginning and the ends. And but we only found 3 trials that actually compared these directly, and actually one of them is an unpublished doctoral thesis from the US, which really is of very low quality. We found no difference between the 2 approaches, although this was based on weak evidence. I'll show you the two meta-analyses. I'm pleased to say it doesn't describe whether it's random or fixed effects, so if you ask me, I'd probably say it's weighted averages. And also, I have to say, the funder requested a pre-specified subgroup analysis, which was that they wanted to know whether phonics instruction was more effective with children who are normally attaining. So you'll see at the top of the slide, ability A are the children who are normally attaining, and at the bottom of the slide, the trials that use children at risk. And I suppose the anecdotal evidence would be that children at risk would benefit more, but actually we didn't find any difference. So we had a very cautious conclusion to this research. You can see yourself there is a serious problem with one of the trials, which is an outlier to the extent it shouldn't really be in the meta-analysis, so I tried to not include it, but again, you know, I was persuaded to include it and do a sensitivity analysis, but actually removing that trial reduces the effect size a little bit, but it renders it not statistically significant. So our statistically significant effect size of 0.27, which is actually quite large in education, goes to non-significance. And then I realised the next meta-analysis is very bright and loud and big, and I think it's all... Oh, sorry. I should just say we did do a funnel plot, and you can see it's quite a nice funnel plot to demonstrate in teaching what happens when the small trials aren't published. So this is yet another caveat. We think there must be publication bias, even though we searched exhaustively in the grey literature. And it looks as though I'm shouting this out to Jim Rose when I went to present to him, but actually I think it was just the way that it came out on the slide. And you can see that the red trial is the unpublished PhD thesis, and the Johnston trial, which shows a big positive effect, is the UK trial. Quite small randomised controlled trial, and quite flawed, really, in the sense that the person delivering, there were 3 interventions, and well, 2 interventions and control condition, and the person delivering all of these was the same person who was also a synthetic phonics advocate. So I have to say the other trial, Togerson, no relation to me, sadly, Joe Togerson from the US, who's done some very good work in this area. This was a high-quality trial. Okay, thanks. And you can see, putting it together, that there's no difference. So what happened in terms of policy? Well, this was March the 21st in 2006, and Ruth Kelly, the Secretary of State for Education, and Jim Rose felt that the case was overwhelming. And the missed opportunity was that when I gave evidence to Jim Rose, I asked him if he would consider recommending, instead of a national rollout, which is the way we normally do it in education, that every school gets the intervention, usually starting with the most disadvantaged groups and then rolling out, that he would allow me to randomly allocate. So instead of it being arbitrary, it would be randomly allocated. But this never happened, of course, and now we're actually seeing that it has made no difference in terms of the interrupted time series. When we look at the national data, there's absolutely no difference. And of course, we could have had a huge randomised controlled trial. It was a greatly missed opportunity. Okay, so I'm nearly at the end now. In the 21st century, I think I'm a lot more optimistic. The United States legislation in 2002 enshrined the use of RCTs in education research in law. And in 2011, the coalition government used £125 million to set up the Education Endowment Foundation. This is the 107th Congress of the US. It's the first page of the Act which sets up the Institutes for Education Sciences. And for efficacy and effectiveness questions, This Act insists that scientifically valid education and evaluation will employ experimental designs using random assignment where possible, and only other strong quasi-experiments where it's not feasible to do random assignment. In the UK, if we think about the equivalent to the IES, which is the Department for Education, the first ever randomised evaluation of a curriculum intervention was in 2009, and this was the national and independent evaluation of Every Child Counts. On December the 9th, the Common Science and Technology Select Committee praised the Every Child Counts evaluation for being scientifically robust and asked some very searching questions of the Department for Education why it didn't fund randomised evaluations of every child a reader, every child a talker, every child a writer, and why it didn't adopt it more widely. So bearing in mind, until 2011, this is the only randomised evaluation. It was big, it was a cluster randomised trial, we had 68 schools, and to be fair to the government, they did change their policy when they looked at our results. The EEF has learned some lessons from the IES, and so all EEF-funded projects are independently and rigorously evaluated, and the design of choice is the randomised controlled trial design. And so this is just my final slide. I suppose this was a brief history of RCTs in education, but it was also a brief history for me because I suppose it was like going from a situation where there were no buses coming along. You know, I think in the 15 years I've been in education, I've managed to get one trial funded every 2 years, and then 5 came along in the last year. And I think this is a really positive movement. The EEF has funded 50 randomised controlled trials, and it's intended that a further £200 million will be put into this programme of developing interventions and evaluating them. So I think I'm rather optimistic. I would just finish with one note of caution, which is that we are really lacking in infrastructure in education. We are lacking in statistical expertise, design, methodologists, and in most cases when I run a trial, I'm working with people from the health field to provide the statistical expertise and the design expertise. So we need more capacity. We need more researchers who are willing to do randomised trials. Okay, thank you.